It was a slow night at the Iron Fork, the restaurant where I worked as a line cook. The place had its quirks: creaky floorboards, an ancient walk-in fridge that groaned like a ghost in a bad mood, and the unsettling fact that it was open 24/7. But it paid well, and at night, the tips were non-existent, so the owners didn't mind letting the night crew slack a bit. That night, it was just me, Tyler, the dishwasher, and Dana, who ran the front of the house. We'd all done our fair share of night shifts before, so when the clock hit 2 a.m. and we still hadn't seen a customer for over an hour, the three of us started debating if we should close early. That's when the door opened. A man walked in. He was tall and gaunt, wearing a long trench coat that looked too heavy for the mild weather. His skin was pale, almost waxy, and he moved with a stiffness that didn't quite seem human. But it wasn't his looks that struck me, it was his smell. Something like rotting meat and damp earth. Dana gave him her best customer service smile, though it faltered slightly when he didn't respond. He simply pointed to a booth in the far corner, where the single overhead light flickered intermittently. "He's your problem now," Dana muttered under her breath as she handed me the order slip. It was blank except for the words chef's choice. Great. Nothing like cooking blind for a creep at 2 a.m. I decided to keep it simple, a burger and fries. As I grilled the patty, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It felt like I was being watched, and when I turned around, I caught a glimpse of the man standing in the doorway of the kitchen, staring directly at me. "Sir, this area is employees only," I said, my voice cracking slightly. He didn't say a word. He just tilted his head, almost like a curious dog, before retreating back to his booth. When Dana delivered the food, she told me he hadn't blinked the entire time she was at the table. He ate with mechanical precision, never looking down at his plate, as though he'd done it 1,000 times before. When he was done, he left without paying, leaving behind a single $2 bill and an unnerving silence that seemed to swallow the restaurant whole. But the real trouble started after he left. The fryer began to hiss and pop violently, spraying oil everywhere. The lights dimmed and then came back brighter, as if someone were turning the dimmer switch up and down rapidly. In the walk-in, I swear I heard whispering. Tyler went in to check and came out pale as a sheet, claiming he heard someone say his name from the far corner, even though no one else was there. "I'm out," Dana said, grabbing her bag and keys. "I don't care if I lose this job. Something isn't right." She left and I couldn't blame her. Tyler followed a few minutes later, muttering something about needing air. That left me alone. The restaurant felt alive, like it was breathing. The air was thick and suffocating, and every sound was amplified. The creak of the floor, the hum of the fridge, the faint buzz of the lights. I tried to focus on cleaning up, convincing myself that the night was just playing tricks on me. And then I heard it, a low growl, coming from the direction of the booth where the man had sat. I froze. Slowly, I turned my head, and that's when I saw it. The booth was empty, but the seat cushion had a dark, wet stain that hadn't been there before. And then, just beyond the booth, near the kitchen door, was a shadow. It wasn't shaped like a person. It was too tall, too thin, and its edges wavered, like it was made of smoke. I bolted for the door, but it wouldn't budge. I could hear heavy footsteps approaching, deliberate and slow. A cold breath brushed against my neck, and I turned to see the shadow looming over me. It reached out, its hand long and clawed, and I braced for whatever was coming. But nothing happened. When I opened my eyes, it was gone. The restaurant was quiet again, almost normal. The door unlocked easily, and I didn't waste a second getting out of there. The next morning, I called the owner to tell him I was quitting. Before I could get the words out, he asked if I'd worked the night shift. "Yeah," I said. There was a long pause before he replied, "You lasted longer than most." Turns out the Iron Fork had a history. Every few months, someone would report strange happenings. Shadows that moved on their own, customers who weren't quite right. Most quit after their first encounter. I should have taken the hint when I got hired without so much as an interview. I never went back, but sometimes late at night I think I see that shadow in my apartment. A week had passed since I quit, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Every corner of my apartment seemed darker than it should have been. Every creak of the floorboards at night felt louder, heavier. Started small at first. My bedroom door would be open in the morning, even though I always closed it before bed. Lights would flicker occasionally, but I told myself it was old wiring. The real trouble began when I noticed the smell. The same rancid stench of rotting meat and damp earth that clung to the man at the restaurant. The first time I smelled it, I checked every inch of the apartment for spoiled food, dead animals, anything that could explain it. Nothing. But the smell would come and go, always lingering just long enough to make my stomach churn. Then the dreams started. Every night I was back in the Iron Fork, standing in the kitchen. The fryer would hiss and pop, louder and louder, until the sound was deafening. The lights would flicker wildly, and then I'd hear the growl. The same low, guttural sound I'd heard in the restaurant that night. In the dreams, I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead, and no matter how much I screamed, no sound would come out. The shadow would appear, tall and wavering, its clawed hand reaching for me. Just before it touched me, I'd wake up, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding like it was trying to escape my chest. One night, after waking from another nightmare, I noticed something strange. On my bedroom wall, where the moonlight hit just right, there was a faint shadow. It didn't match anything in the room, and when I moved, it didn't move with me. I stared at it, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But then it shifted. The edges wavered, and it grew taller, stretching up to the ceiling. My breath caught in my throat as I realized it was the same shadow I'd seen at the restaurant. Before I could react, a loud bang came from the kitchen. I jumped out of bed, grabbing the baseball bat I kept under the bed for emergencies, and crept toward the noise. The stench was overpowering now, making my eyes water. The kitchen was a mess. Cabinet doors were open, pots and pans scattered across the floor. The fridge door hung ajar, and its contents were spilled out, but none of the food looked right. The vegetables were wilted and blackened, and the milk was curdled even though the expiration date was weeks away. Then I saw it. On the far wall, scrawled in what looked like grease or something worse, were the words, "You can't leave." My heart sank. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew it wasn't good. I backed out of the kitchen, keeping my eyes on the wall, and nearly tripped over something. When I looked down, I froze. It was a $2 bill, the same one the man had left at the Iron Fork. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat on the couch with all the lights on, clutching the bat like it was the only thing keeping me alive. I kept telling myself I was imagining things, that it was just stress or a really messed up prank. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next day, I decided to do some research. I wanted to know more about the Iron Fork and its history. Maybe there was an explanation for what was happening, something logical that could put my mind at ease. I spent hours digging through old newspapers and forums, piecing together the restaurant's past. What I found made my blood run cold. The building had been a restaurant for decades, but it had changed hands more times than I could count. Every owner complained of strange occurrences: flickering lights, objects moving on their own, mysterious noises at night. Several employees had gone missing over the years, their disappearances chalked up to bad luck or poor record-keeping. And then there was the fire. 20 years ago, when the restaurant was called Elliot's Eatery, a massive kitchen fire broke out in the middle of the night. The only person on duty was a line cook, a man named Harold Green. His body was never found, but witnesses claimed to have seen him running out of the building, covered in burns, before disappearing into the night. Rumor had it Harold had been obsessed with the restaurant, even after it changed owners. Some said he'd been seen lingering around the building at night, long after the fire. Others claimed he'd cursed the place, vowing that no one would ever leave. The last known sighting of Harold? He was wearing a long trench coat, just like the man who had walked into the Iron Fork. That night, I locked every door and window in my apartment. I burned sage and played some cheap meditation video from YouTube, hoping to ward off whatever was haunting me. But as I sat there, clutching the bat, I realized something terrifying. The smell was back, and it was coming from inside the apartment. The stench was unbearable. It clung to the air, thick and nauseating, like something was decaying in the walls. But it wasn't just the smell that put me on edge. It was the silence. The kind that presses in on you, amplifying every creak and groan of the building. I stood there, bat in hand, straining my ears for any sign of movement. And then I heard it. A soft, wet dragging sound. It was coming from the hallway outside my apartment. I froze, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run, but my feet wouldn't move. The sound grew louder, closer, until it stopped just outside my door. My eyes darted to the peephole, but I couldn't bring myself to look through it. Instead, I backed up slowly, keeping the bat raised, as though that would help me against whatever was on the other side. And then the doorknob started to turn. The sound was slow, deliberate, the metal groaning as it twisted back and forth. My heart raced as I whispered to myself, "Asterisk, it's locked. It's locked. It's locked." Asterisk, but then, with a sickening click, the door swung open. There was nothing there. No person, no shadow, no sign of anything that could have turned the knob. Just the empty hallway stretching out into the dim glow of a flickering overhead light. But that smell, God, it was stronger now, like it was radiating from the open doorway. I stepped forward, bat raised, and peeked out. The hallway was empty, but something felt wrong. The air was heavy, almost like it was vibrating, and the shadows seemed to ripple and shift, even though nothing was moving. And then I saw it. A trail of dark, wet footprints leading down the hall. They were uneven, as though whoever or whatever made them was dragging one leg. The prints led to the stairwell at the end of the corridor, disappearing into the darkness below. I knew I should have stayed in my apartment, locked the door, and called the cops. But some irrational part of me needed to know, needed to see. So I stepped into the hallway, the bat trembling in my grip, and followed the footprints. As I approached the stairwell, the air grew colder, the stench almost unbearable now. The darkness at the bottom of the stairs seemed to pulse, like it was alive, and for a moment, I thought I saw something moving in it. A shape, tall and thin, with edges that wavered like smoke. And then it spoke. "Asterisk, you can't leave. Asterisk." The voice was low and guttural, like it was scraping its way out of a throat that hadn't been used in years. It echoed up the stairwell, reverberating through my chest, and for a second, I thought my heart had stopped. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the bat, and turned to run back to my apartment. But when I looked down the hallway, I froze. The shadow was there, standing in front of my door. It was taller than I remembered, its edges flickering like a bad TV signal. Its head tilted to the side, just like the man in the trench coat, and I swear I could feel it watching me, even though it didn't have eyes. I was trapped. The stairwell behind me, the shadow in front. My breath came in shallow gasps as I gripped the bat tighter, trying to figure out what to do. And then the shadow moved. It didn't walk or glide. It just shifted, like it was skipping through space. 1 second it was at my door. The next it was inches from me, its form towering over me, blotting out the light. I swung the bat as hard as I could. It passed through the shadow like it wasn't even there, the force of the swing spinning me around and leaving me off balance. I stumbled, hitting the wall, and that's when I felt it, cold, sharp claws brushing against my neck. I screamed and bolted, not caring where I was going, as long as it was away. I ran down the stairs, taking them 2 at a time, the shadow's presence pressing against me like a weight on my back. When I reached the lobby, I burst through the front door and into the street. The air was cool, fresh, and for a brief moment, I thought I was safe. But then I saw it. Across the street, standing under a flickering street lamp, was the shadow. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching me, its form flickering and shifting like it was struggling to stay in this reality. And then it raised its hand, pointing directly at me. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I ran. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like they would give out, until the city lights blurred into streaks of color and the sound of my own heartbeat drowned out everything else. I don't know how far I ran or how long. All I know is that when I finally stopped, I was alone, standing in the middle of an empty street, with no sign of the shadow. But I wasn't relieved, because in my pocket, where there had been nothing before, I found it. A $2 bill. I stared at the $2 bill in my hand, trembling. The feel of it was wrong. Too crisp, too perfect, as if it had never been touched by human hands. The faint stench of rotting meat seemed to cling to it, making my stomach churn. This can't be happening, I thought. Shoving the bill back into my pocket like that would somehow erase its existence. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself this was just a nightmare, the pounding in my chest told me otherwise. I needed help. Answers. Anything. My first thought was to call the cops. But what could I tell them? That a shadow monster from a cursed restaurant was following me? They'd lock me in a padded cell faster than I could finish the sentence. No, I needed to figure this out myself. That's when I remembered the articles I'd read about the Iron Fork. There was one name that stuck out. Harold Green, the obsessed line cook who had vanished after the fire. If anyone, or anything, could explain what was happening, it was him. I made my way to the nearest 24-hour library, a relic in a digital age but a sanctuary for someone desperate enough to find answers. The librarian didn't even glance at me as I walked in. Drenched in sweat and reeking of fear, I dove into the archives, sifting through old news clippings, death records, and even rumors posted on obscure forums. What I found only deepened my dread. Harold wasn't just a line cook. He was a self-taught occultist, obsessed with rituals and ancient texts. Employees at Elliot's Eatery, the precursor to the Iron Fork, had complained about his strange behavior. He'd carve symbols into cutting boards, mumble in dead languages, and keep jars of ingredients in the walk-in that no one dared open. The night of the fire, Harold had been working alone, testing what he called the conduit ritual. According to his notes, the restaurant itself was a perfect vessel. Something about its layout, its history, and its constant flux of energy. He believed he could summon a mirror entity, a being that would grant him immortality by anchoring him to the physical world. But the fire broke out before he could complete the ritual. Witnesses claimed to have seen Harold run out of the burning building, his trench coat smoldering, but no one could explain how he disappeared after that. The police never found his body. I stared at the final line of his notes, scribbled hastily and included in a blog post by someone claiming to be a paranormal investigator. Once the conduit is opened, it cannot be closed. The mirror will follow the strongest tether. It will not stop. The strongest tether. That had to be me. Somehow, by interacting with the man at the restaurant, if you could even call him a man, I'd become its anchor. I felt the $2 bill in my pocket again, its presence like a weight pressing against me. It wasn't just a bill. It was a marker, a claim, and the shadow wouldn't stop until it had me. I needed to end this, but I had no idea how. The notes offered no solutions, only warnings. But one thing was clear. Everything started at the Iron Fork. If I wanted to survive, I had to go back. It was nearly 3 a.m. when I arrived at the restaurant. The building loomed in the dark, its sign flickering like a dying heartbeat. The smell hit me as soon as I stepped out of the car, stronger than ever, as though the place itself was rotting from the inside out. The front door was unlocked. Of course it was. I stepped inside, the creak of the floorboards echoing through the empty dining room. The air was thick, oppressive, like walking through a storm cloud. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but I forced myself forward. The kitchen was just as I'd left it, pots and pans still scattered from the night I'd quit. But there was something new. On the floor, scrawled in what looked like blood, was a single word: come. The walk-in fridge door was open. Light spilled out, cold and unnatural, casting long shadows that seemed to ripple and twist like living things. My breath fogged in front of me as I stepped closer, my heartbeat so loud it drowned out everything else. Inside the fridge, the shadow waited. It was bigger now, filling the space, its edges writhing like smoke caught in a storm. Its form wavered, but its presence was undeniable. And in the center of it, I saw him, Harold Green, or what was left of him. His face was twisted, burned, barely human, but his eyes, Those piercing, hateful eyes were alive. He stared at me, and his mouth moved, though his voice came from everywhere at once. Asterisk, you took my tether. Now you are mine. Asterisk, the shadow surged toward me, and I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed a pot of oil from the counter and hurled it at the shadow. It passed through harmlessly, but it gave me just enough time to reach the walk-in door. I slammed it shut, locking the shadow inside. The light inside the fridge grew brighter, spilling through the cracks in the door, and the entire restaurant began to shake. The growling, the whispers, the flickering lights, they all reached a fever pitch, and then silence. The stench was gone. The air felt lighter. For the first time in days, I could breathe. I stumbled outside, collapsing on the curb as the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon. I didn't know if it was truly over, but one thing was certain: I wasn't tethered anymore. In my pocket, the $2 bill was gone.